thank you all for inviting me. It's lovely to come back to Duke, see old friends. I mean, I've been following the Ralph Bunche Institute for years. I've had wonderful students who've come out of the program. It's a real pleasure to be here. I had a wonderful conversation, which I probably monopolized too much with this table over here. So, you know, in my official role, so that was my kind of personal thanks to you all for inviting me. My official role as president of the association, I want to thank Duke University for sponsoring and hosting and managing this thing. I want to thank Paula McClain, who's the kind of presiding genius over RBSI for however many years?
20.
For 20 years, and without Paula, you all wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be here, none of us would be here. So. And I want to thank Kim Mealy and the American Political Science Association staff. Kim is kind of a mother hen, kind of manages this program and kind of oversees it and kind of protects it. And I think the whole APSA staff are equally enthusiastic about, committed to, engaged with the program. It's really something that we as an association feel tremendously proud of, and we want to keep it going and keep it going at the same level of quality of the students and quality of the program. And of course, the other people to thank are the faculty and the PhD students who have done so much work in helping you guys become the scholars that you're going to become. So, long list, but it takes a village and all that sort of thing. So. I want to say just a couple of things, and it's mostly aimed at these two tables. I want to just talk to you about why you all ought to become political scientists, in case you haven't already become committed. And we'll all keep track to make sure that you really do over the next few years. I think it's a wonderful time to study politics or to be political scientists. For a bunch of reasons. And one of them is obviously the current election. It's a totally fascinating election with, there's a tremendous amount at stake. We all know that. I'm not going to walk through the politics of the current primary season and the convention season and the next election. But, for a political scientist, if you can somehow stand aside from your personal politics, we couldn't imagine a more exciting time to be studying politics. I mean, sort of everything we thought we knew about presidential elections is falling apart. The kind of canonical study is called The Party Decides, right? I teach it in my graduate seminar. And whatever else is going on in the Republican Party, a book with the title The Party Decides almost certainly isn't right. So who does decide, right? I mean, primary voters, but so we got to do a lot better work in thinking about kind of intensity. I mean, the classic logic of democratic theory is one person, one vote, and of course that's, at least in principle, how our system operates. But if you have a primary system, intense voters carry much more weight than non-intense voters or non-intense non-voters. So I don't think we as a discipline have a good handle on how to think about intensity within politics. So there's just lots and lots of, apart from the politics of the current presidential election, there's a lot of political science that we really need to think about. This may be one of those things that we used to call a realigning election. There's been a lot of debunking of the whole logic of whether an election or an electoral period can fundamentally change the underlying divisions in a society. We used to think 1896 was one of those years, 1860, 1932. Maybe that's what's going on right now. And so we are going to have a fundamentally different political dynamic over the next decade than we've had over the past decade. So this is a perfect time to start studying political science. And then, of course, if you get outside the United States, all I have to say is the word Brexit. And we all know that the sort of the politics of what's going on in the European Union. I can say MENA, Middle East and North Africa. I can say migration. I mean, all we need is kind of one-word little snippets to show you how important the study of politics is right now, in a way that I think is really quite different than, every year is different from every previous year. But anyway, there's just an awful lot going on. I guess the other thing I would say about contemporary politics that feels very different is the much greater recognition of class dynamics in the United States. There always have been class dynamics in the United States, of course, but we've never talked, I don't think there's ever been a moment, those of you who know history can help me, correct me if I'm wrong, where the word socialist was uttered by a person who was a political candidate to identify him or herself. Socialist is a bad word in the United States. And suddenly we have a candidate who's a serious candidate who calls himself a democratic socialist. Whoa. And he actually makes a pretty big... So there's just a tremendous amount of political stuff going on. Some of it is pretty scary and bad, there's no question of that. And some of it is just genuinely exciting from a disciplinary academic perspective, apart from In fact, I'm scared to death about what's going to happen over the next 6 months. Set that aside. So I want to say a little bit also about the sort of particular study of the politics of race and ethnicity in the United States. I study mostly American politics, although I would say parenthetically, you should do as I say and not as I do, which has become much more comparative in your study of race, ethnicity, certainly migration. The way we think about race, ethnicity, migration, configurations, we've got to be more comparative. I'm not very good at that, but you all should be. So this is a do as I. But just within the United States. So it seems to me, I mean, I just sat around my hotel room this afternoon reading newspaper articles that I had been collecting over the last couple months. So there's bad news and there's good news, and then there's ambivalent news, right? So the bad news, again, I can do it in kind of one or two words. I can say the word incarceration, or I can say the word carceral state if you want to be a little more ideological about it. And we all know exactly what that means, right? I mean, there's something like 2 to 2.5 million people who are incarcerated in the United States. There's another 6 or 7 million who are under carceral supervision. You've all seen those charts about how the United States is 17 times orders of magnitude more likely to incarcerate people than, I think, the next state, which is Zambia or something like that, which may be Russia. Very disproportionately non-Anglo, of course, very disproportionately gendered, very disproportionately age graded. So all I have to say is incarceration, and we kind of all know what the consequences of that are. Schooling. So in 2013, these data I happened to read this afternoon were something like 40% of black students, but only 14% of white students in the 8th grade read below basic competency. So 40% of African American students in 8th grade are not reading at the level of competency for their age. That's really scary. There's a lot of academic literature on the growth of racialization. I don't know, were you reading Michael Tesler this fall? So the idea that a whole lot of issues that didn't used to be thought of in racial terms have become racialized over the last, certainly since the Obama election of 2008, perhaps before that. My favorite example is that if you talk about the healthcare policy and you attach the word Clinton to it, you get a different set of responses from white respondents than if you attach the word Obama to the exact same description. So it suddenly turns into a race issue if the word Obama is attached to it. So obviously increase in the last few months of kind of overt racism, overt anti-Muslim sentiment, overt anti-immigration sentiment, kind of xenophobia, nationalism. I don't have to go through all the details of that. Tremendous growth in income inequality, both within groups as well as across groups. Actually, quiz time. What's the racial ethnic group in the United States that has the greatest intra-group income inequality? Blacks. So there's more income inequality. Now, this is not to say that wealthy blacks are as wealthy whites. There is a huge racial disparity. But within the group, there is high and rising levels of income inequality. So there's a lot of bad news, right? I mean, my colleague Matt Desmond just wrote a book on eviction, which I think is the female equivalent of incarceration, which is to say families are just kind of totally destroyed by eviction in a way that we haven't really fully recognized. I think incarceration came on the scene 6 or 8 or 10 years ago. Housing and eviction is going to be the next decade's kind of issues. Having said all of that, let me give you some good news. And the point of all of this is that the study of racial and ethnic politics is really complicated and really important and really interesting. So, for example, I mean, probably the single biggest good news is the decline in the racial disparity of life expectancy. But 10 or 15 years ago, whites on average lived about 7 or 8 years longer than blacks did. Now it's about a little bit over 3 years longer. Now, whites are still living longer than blacks. So I don't want to say that the racial disparities disappeared. But it's been cut in half in about a decade or two. And that's an extraordinary transformation from a demographics perspective. Nothing ever happens fast in demography. Right. And this was an amazingly fast change. And it came about for a whole bunch of different, basically good reasons. In 1990, there were about 40 homicides per 100,000 young men of 18 to 24. By 2014, there were about 20. So the number of homicides of young men has been halved in the last 20 or 30 years. Those are very disproportionately black. The data are homicide of young men, but an overwhelming share of that decline has been among young black men. HIV mortality among young blacks, 25 to 45-year-old black men, has declined by 90% over the last 25 years. Middle-aged blacks are living much longer. The decline in cancer, decline in heart disease, decline in death from these phenomena. EITC, Medicaid, for pregnant women, the ACA, the Obamacare have all improved infant mortality. Infant mortality has been stuck in racial disparity for a long time, and suddenly infant mortality is now declining over the last decade. The consequence of all of this is a huge decline in the disparity of life expectancy. So whatever else is happening, people are just living longer and living better. There's evidence on kind of the number of days lost to work, or the number of kind of just bad health measures are also declining. So on balance, the most fundamental, probably the core measure of improved quality of life, we're doing better. The prison population has leveled off over the last couple of years. By some measures, it's actually beginning to decline. There's some suggestion that both conservative and sort of left and right members of Congress are converging on the idea that incarceration levels are totally out of control. And for perhaps different ideological or political reasons, nonetheless, there may be actually an alliance within Congress, within the state legislatures, to do something about incarceration. Among those under 18 who are incarcerated, which is, of course, the scariest and most long-term, life-changing ages to be incarcerated, declined from about 4,000 in 1998 to about 1,000 in 2014. My numbers can't be right, probably 40,000 to 10,000, but in any case, it's a 4 times, the decline has gone, the number of young men incarcerated has gone way, way down over the last decades. So here's my favorite good news piece of story. Gallup asks people about how happy they are, and asks them how happy do they think they're going to be, what do they think their life satisfaction is going to be 5 years from now. Now, of course, nobody has any idea remotely what the right answer to that question is. So we shouldn't think of this as a prediction. We should think of this simply as a slightly indirect measure of what you think about your own life right now. Poor blacks are 3 times more likely than poor whites to be optimistic about themselves in 5 years from now. So on balance, they describe themselves as being happier than poor whites do, and they are much more likely to describe themselves as expecting to be happy 5 years from now than are poor whites. Poor Hispanics are about 1.5 times more likely than poor whites to describe themselves as either happy now or expecting to be happy sometime in the foreseeable future. And this is the one that actually surprised me the most from this particular study. Middle-class blacks are 50% less likely to describe themselves as stressed than are middle-class whites. Again, I don't know what these numbers measure, but if you think they're measuring some indication of something about your self-perception or your sense of kind of the trajectory of your life, middle-class blacks feel better than middle-class whites do, poor blacks feel better than poor whites do, poor Latinos feel better than poor whites do. So it's a complicated story. And I don't want to argue that things are necessarily getting better. I don't want to argue things necessarily. Whereas my point here is that there's just an awful lot of very mixed evidence out there, and a lot of very mixed political, social, economic, cultural, interpersonal phenomena that we don't have a good handle on. I mean, we can all, I think, pick a piece of this elephant, and we do, and most of us pick one piece of it and study it really intensely and well, but trying to get a handle on kind of what's getting better, what's getting worse, why, are these mutually causal, are these simply different parts of the population? So I think there's a lot of political science out there to be done. That's all I want to say. I think there's a lot in the sort of the field of democratic theory, democratic political philosophy in contemporary politics that we need to spend some more time on. My current favorite examples are how do we think about majority preferences? So we're all frustrated, or at least I'm totally frustrated, about gun control. And if you look at survey research, there's a clear, persistent, absolutely consistent majority support for at least certain kinds of gun control. It's been there for 20 or 30 or 40 years. It shows up in every single survey that you look at. There is an equally clear, consistent, persistent majority support for decrease in immigration over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. So how do we think about that relationship? Well, if you believe that majority preferences ought to control the way we as a country manage guns, do we also believe that majority preferences ought to control the way that we as a country manage immigration? From my ideological perspective, the answer to the first is yes, and the answer to the second is no. That's easy. But of course, it isn't easy. You got to think of a good philosophical argument about why you think we should support majority preferences when they agree with my views, and we should resist majority preferences when they don't agree with my views. I could probably come up with some answers, and probably everybody else in the room could too. But there's a lot of kind of democratic theory here that we actually need to take seriously if we're going to think hard about what it means to live in a society where lots of people disagree with us, and lots of politicians don't do what we think they ought to be doing anyway. Similarly, we all been following the headlines in the last week in the Supreme Court, right? So again, this is a standard issue in political science with lots and lots of work about sort of the role of the courts, but I think there's lots more to be done. I celebrated some of those Supreme Court decisions in the last week or two. I deplored several of the others. Do we think the court ought to not be making decisions that feel to me a lot like policy decisions? Well, yes, if they agree with what I want the policy decision to be, and no if they don't. I mean, that seems easy. But of course it isn't. So I think if you just read the headlines, there's a lot of work for political scientists to do. I'm almost ready to stop. One more arena, which again, this table and I were talking about kind of the politics of science. I think we as a discipline are not doing a very good job of thinking about the politics of science, or at least haven't done a very good job. This is a new field for me, so maybe it's just I don't know the literature very well, but that's probably true. The conventional wisdom, again, is that the left is pro-science. Think about climate change, think about evolution, think about stem cell research. But you can think of other arenas where essentially the right, or another set of the population, is more pro-science. Fracking, genetically modified foods, peaceful use of nuclear energy, technological surveillance. Right? So how do we understand the politics around scientific innovation? I think all of these issues are going to become increasingly central to our lives over the next, generation or two. You guys are going to be dealing with all these issues in a way that my generation, not so much for too many more years. So again, I just think there's lots of issues, both within the arena of racial and ethnic politics, within the arena of American politics, and more generally. A couple of comments on graduate study of political science. There will inevitably be, as you have perhaps already discovered, a good deal of slogging through stuff that you're really not terribly interested in. Theorists are going to have to take methods courses. Methodologists are going to have to take theory courses. You're all going to have to take courses with faculty who are pretty good, and you're all going to take courses with faculty who aren't very good, or aren't very committed, or aren't very engaged, and that's just a fact of life. Qualitative researchers have always felt, and will continue always to feel, under siege. So there's going to be unpleasant and, from my perspective, unproductive methodological battles, which have existed and will continue. There will always be departmental politics, and you will always get tangled up in them in a way that you should, my single biggest piece of advice is avoid, avoid, avoid. Don't get tangled up in departmental politics, but they'll happen. There will never be enough money for your research. That's just life. But having said that, and again, I think I got a feel from the conversation we were having earlier, there's a tremendous excitement. You open a book for the first time. You start a course for the first time. You start writing the new paper. You start thinking about the book project. You start thinking about the dissertation. And there's just nothing like that. I mean, there's lots of things in life that are pretty enjoyable. I wouldn't want to say it's the single most enjoyable thing of life. But there's something just this enormous privilege in just being able to spend your time thinking, at least some of your time, not enough of it, thinking about something that you think is really important. And you get to start it again. And you finish one project and it's never as good as you want it to be, but then you get to start a new one, Isn't that right? Is this making sense? For those of you who've done this? All right, so this, it's an unbelievably privileged position. And that's, I guess, kind of where I want to stop is we can all complain. I can complain about my department. I can give you an hour or two of things that are wrong. But it's just an unbelievably lucky, privileged opportunity. And so that's what I want to do. So, good luck.